Morning, everybody. Happy hump day. Where's my tea? And welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's political editor, John Stevens. Morning, John.
Hi, morning, Susie.
I'm still writing the script, even as the credits are running. So this is the People's Paper Review. So get into the comments, ask us your questions. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to try planning ahead, won't you? Now, so what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on former Health Secretary Matt Hancock's appearance at the COVID inquiry yesterday, where he blamed everyone except himself for what went wrong. But first, I want to take us to page 6, I think it is, where a National Audit Office report has found that children are being taught in schools that are crumbling down around their ears. In fact, there was a leaked report last year that said there could even be a threat to lives. I wish I was making this stuff up, John. What does this National Audit Office report say?
Yeah, so this is one of the public spending watchdogs. They've been looking into the situation with crumbling schools. It's something that different people have been raising the alarm over for the last couple of months and years. Teachers, teaching unions, different groups warning that there is a problem going on here. And what the NAO has found is that 700,000 pupils are being taught in schools that
Sorry, how many? Nearly 750,000.
Yeah, 700,000. And so the NAO is warning that this is obviously problematic. You've got the danger that some of these schools could be unsafe. The government doesn't actually know how many of these schools are unsafe. And you've also got the problem of children not learning in great conditions. So a lot of these buildings are either too hot or too cold. I mean, to be honest, reading that report, it sounds a bit like working in Parliament. But we know seriously that if children are in classrooms that are way too sweaty or way too cold, then it makes it much more difficult for them to learn.
Yeah, we found a nice bit of video there of a nice, clean, well-functioning classroom, looks like. But so we've got, what do you think, everybody? What are your experiences of schools, or any of you teachers, or any of you parents? What have you seen at your children's schools? I know that my daughter's school, they've got a canteen out in the playground as a separate building, and there is a crack in one of the corners outside that you can put your fist in to get actually inside into the canteen. Weather like this, it's not too bad, just extra ventilation, right? But in the winter, it's pretty cold and pretty wet and horrible. Now, so we've got schools and classrooms that are too hot, too cold, too damp, too leaky. There are schools who have roofs made out of the same kind of concrete as many hospitals and public buildings, which they have since found out they know fails and needs replacing. There's schools teaching children in porta cabins. There are schools that are literally falling down around children's ears, even as they're sat at their desks. But the thing is, John, I can remember more than 10 years ago when I was still on the road and actually had a proper job, going to a school in Margate, I think it was, where the school was exactly like that. All the pupils being taught in porta cabins. The porta cabins actually stacked too high in the playground, and they'd just been turned down for funding for a rebuild under the austerity measures. But it's been a decade for the government, various governments, to fix this. So what's gone wrong?
Yeah, well, in this report, there's some figures that set out. It says that the Department for Education said that they needed to spend £7 billion a year on refurbishing schools, repairing schools, and rebuilding schools. And actually, the NEO have gone through and found that rather than £7 billion being spent a year, surprise, surprise, it's actually worked out more about £3 billion a year. And so, you know, it is not a shock to find out that if you spend half the money that you need to, that you're going to find problems down the road with schools falling apart. And this has obviously been going on for a long time. This hasn't been a short-term cut in funding. This has been going on for several years. And therefore, I think it's quite easy for the Labour Party to make this case, which we know they're going to make on loads of different issues. One of their big campaign messages at the next election is going to be Britain is broken after 13 years of Tory rule. And this is yet another example that plays into that narrative.
You said there that it's £7 billion, they reckon, to repair what needs fixing in the education system, in the education budget. Now, the total education budget, I've just had a quick Google, is about £80 billion a year. So we're looking at just under 10% of the total budget to actually refurbish all the schools. And I suspect that had they actually been refurbishing them as needed over the last sort of decade and a half, it wouldn't be 7 billion. And it would actually have cost a bit less, but the back up the bill wouldn't be so bad. But to spend 10% of the total budget, I mean, it's pretty much undoable, which is perhaps why in 2020 they lowered it to 5.3 billion. And they said, we don't need to spend all that. We're only going to spend 5.3. And they've actually, how much they've spent since then, I think was only 3.1 billion. So it's half what was needed. And the NAO report says that they're not hitting their targets of the rebuilds that they've committed to either. So, I mean, it's just being handled really badly.
Yeah, and you compare this to the rhetoric of when you hear speeches from people like Rishi Sunak and government ministers, they talk about the importance of education, how it's so important for social mobility, meaning that poor kids don't just end up poor for the rest of their lives, that it is such an important thing for children in their development. If the children are going to be able to access good careers, they need good curriculum and good schooling and good education. But you just match that with the reality of what's happening on the ground and children just learning in poor classrooms. And it's just really hard for them to actually get on and do the business of learning.
Yeah. And what do you think, everybody? Is this a problem with people not being able to spend the money wisely, perhaps? Most schools these days have control of their own budgets. So do you think perhaps they just spent it on the wrong thing and they should have been spending it on the roofs and they've spent it on, I don't know, a staff pay rise or something? Do you think this is up to the schools to fix, or do you think it's up to central government? Because, I mean, it's all turning out to be a bit more expensive and damaging than if they're just kept on top of repairs during that austerity period, John. But I suppose George Osborne, if he was here, I'd never invite him. But I suppose if he was here, he would blame the schools for not spending their own funds better, wouldn't he? That he's given them control of their budgets. Here's your money. You are in charge of this. What would the schools say about that, though?
Well, I think that we all know that schools aren't rolling in loads of money, that they've not been spending it on the buildings, they've been spending it out on something else. They just haven't had the cash. We've heard all the stories, we've read them in the Mirror about schools having to go to parents to raise money to pay for paper and pencils and toilet roll. That it is hardly like schools have been just spending all this money on all sorts of things rather than the basics, such as keeping their buildings in check. That I don't think there has been enough money going into the schools' budgets for them to be able to do this.
No, exactly. It's not like they've been down the casino, is it?
Exactly.
And merrily going, like the Bank of England does, for example, and just go, oh no, let's stick it all on black. Let's see how it works out. That hasn't really been happening. So it's been pretty poor, the outlook for schools then at the moment, and the repairs just haven't been kept up. But do you think that that's going to change? I mean, we are heading into an election period. They're going to have to start making promises, because there's a lot of parents who vote, a lot of grandparents who vote. People see what the problem is here. That, you know, if Labour comes out and says we're going to spend X in education, they're going to win it, aren't they?
Yeah, I think this is the tricky thing for Labour, that they're very good at diagnosing the problems. And so we can see it here in education. We know all the problems in other areas like the health service, but there isn't loads of money rolling around in the coffers for them to be able to spend on things. So the question is, what do? Do you borrow some more money? Do you raise taxes? Do you kind of prioritize budgets in a different way? Do you start spending a bit less on other things, spending more on education instead? And I think that is something you're going to see the Labour Party setting out more of. We know next week that Keir Starmer is giving a big speech on opportunity. That's likely to include a lot of things about education. And I think that you are going to see the Labour Party setting out more and more as we get closer to election, how exactly would they do things differently so we don't have these problems going forward.
Exactly. And we've got to remember the Labour Party is in their sort of pre-election cycle at the moment. Their National Policy Forum is coming up with those manifesto pledges. So the period before now, they couldn't really have much to promise because that's how they operate. Over the summer, the NPF is coming up with ideas. Hopefully the test veterans are in it. And then, things go forward as we push into the next election cycle. So Scott says we can blame the government for taking crisis loans from people in Scotland when for some reason we don't. But some person in England decided to take the money anyway. I don't understand. John?
Gosh, don't ask me. I've got no clue what that means.
I don't understand. Sorry. I think you're talking about crisis loans to people on benefits, which is a little bit different to the education and schools thing that we're talking about. But there is a difference between how Scotland and England are run. And so far, the people in England haven't been arrested for anything. That's about all I can say. Right, we need to move on to the main story of the day, which is that, so speaking really of failing to plan, which is the topic of today's broadcast, it would seem, let's turn our attention to the COVID inquiry, where the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, was giving evidence yesterday. He's used to being on telly now, isn't he? He announced that he was profoundly sorry, and it was greeted with about as much sympathy as if he'd been apologising for failing to win a trial in the I'm a Celebrity jungle. Here's a clip of it.
Because of these, this huge error in the doctrine that the UK, and by the way, the whole Western world had in how to tackle a pandemic, and that flawed doctrine underpinned many of the problems that made it extremely difficult to respond. And if I may say so, I am profoundly sorry for the impact that had. I'm profoundly sorry for each death that has occurred. And I also understand why, for some, it will be hard to take that apology from me.
Now, John, I can remember around the time of various leaked WhatsApp messages, there was stuff in there advising Matt about how to appear on air at those press conferences he gave during COVID, how to appear more sympathetic. His now girlfriend, Gina Coladangelo, was behind a lot of that advice and making him look good. Do you think that is partly why that the relatives of the COVID dead that he was apologising to yesterday turned their backs on him and really didn't care?
Yeah, I think that it was a good thing that he did say sorry. I think that everyone has got to accept that. But you can see why people who lost lives in the pandemic didn't really want to hear that from him, and that it's very difficult, especially when it is Matt Hancock who comes across as, or he likes to think he comes across as, a smooth operator a lot of the time. And I don't want to be unfair, but sometimes you feel that some of the things that he says feel slightly rehearsed, maybe not totally natural. And so I think that it is perhaps not surprising that that didn't go down particularly well with a lot of families when it was delivered yesterday.
Yeah, I think your dog agrees as well, John. Either that or the postman's outside. So we had all this situation, a bit of a rigmarole when he was at the inquiry. The relatives turned their backs on him. They heckled him. One even came dressed as the Grim Reaper. No one feels particularly sorry for Matt Hancock on that aspect, I suppose. But do you, dear viewer, do you think his apology was sincere? Do you think that it matters that he made it, even if people didn't necessarily take it at the time? Deborah says sorry is not going to bring people back. Quite right. So what did he say then while he was there? Well, he revealed, as he said briefly in that clip, that the problem with pandemic preparedness was doctrine, that planners had basically just decided in advance that we were all doomed. And so they planned for body bags, but not PPE, which is perhaps why people who needed PPE suddenly started wearing body bags. So they didn't really think about how to get through it. They just thought that we were all doomed. Now, he blamed all this on how the process was planned and everything else. Now, remind me, John, who was the guy with responsibility for planning for this?
Yeah, well, at one point yesterday, when they were talking about care homes, and we know how bad things were with care homes, that we know the government said they threw a protective ring around care homes, but actually the reality didn't really show that. There was one point where Matt Hancock was saying that the preparations in the social care sector were terrible. And the barrister who was questioning him on behalf of the COVID inquiry actually said to him, well, what was your title at the time of the start of the pandemic? And Matt Hancock had to admit that his title was Health and Social Care Secretary. And he did kind of try and push the blame, saying that a lot of the preparations, they're actually the fault of local authorities. They were responsible and shouldn't have been doing this. But, you know, Matt Hancock was there in the Department of Health and Social Care when there were these problems coming down the line. And it doesn't seem like in the run up to pandemic, he did much to change them.
No, and the problem with the social care service, of course, is that although we've got a Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, he's not in charge of the social care because that's all run by private companies who have, you know, regulators and profit motives and other things going on. And they go and buy their own kit and equipment and stuff. They don't have a big tied up kind of organisation to do anything. Now, he said that he threw a protective ring around those care homes, as you said. He later blamed the care home staff for infecting their own patients. And at the inquiry, he admitted he didn't even know how many care homes there were, which, as the Secretary of State for the care homes, is astonishing. And because they weren't all tied up, there's no overall planning, they wouldn't know how they would operate and so on. Is it me, or is that just a really big argument was he making effectively an argument for a nationalised care service?
Well, I just think it seems quite slippery to go there and say you're profoundly sorry, point out all the problems, and then say, well, but hands up, it was nothing to do with me, that was totally someone else, and point the finger over there. Then I think that is quite problematic. And obviously, the whole point of this inquiry is to learn lessons. We know in the first module, looking at the preparations for the pandemic, were there things that we could have done slightly different in the months and years leading up to coronavirus that would have prepared us better? So building up those stocks of PPE, making sure that we had plans in place for the possibility of a lockdown. Matt Hancock said that's something that they'd never really looked at before. So, yeah, I think there's quite a lot of criticism of Matt Hancock, but we do need to learn lessons from it so that if there is another pandemic in the next few years, that we don't make these mistakes all over again.
Well, that would be ideal, wouldn't it? That is the purpose behind it. But what do you think, everybody? Are we going to be able to learn those lessons if the people who give evidence at the COVID inquiry are busy blaming everybody else? If they're not in there actually sort of saying anything we can put our faith in, who's going to learn anything? Dee says, saying sorry and taking action and responsibility are two completely different things. They're all responsible. They all should be investigated and should all be held responsible for what they're doing. I suppose they've got to come to the inquiry and sort of be held to account in that way. But that's all they're ever going to face on this, isn't it, John? Unless the inquiry comes back in several years' time and pins it all on Matt Hancock somehow, he's never going to have anything more than questions to answer.
No, I think that's quite unlikely. I think that at each stage of this, you're likely to see different politicians appear. So there's going to be a whole chapter on the care homes when I think there will be a lot more questions about that issue of that protective ring that they claimed to have thrown around the care homes. It didn't prove to be the point. There's going to be a whole section on vaccines, a whole section on general government decision making. And so, yeah, I don't think this is the last we're going to hear from Matt Hancock at the COVID inquiry. I think we're going to hear a lot more from him. But I think it's unlikely that the COVID inquiry, when it comes to its kind of final report, will pin the blame on individuals. I think it would be much more likely that it's about the government as a whole and coming up with ways that we can do things differently in the future.
Yeah, well, I look forward to some more Matt Hancock. Thanks, John. Speaking of which, though, and it's interesting that you mentioned there about the way the funding was operating and the PPE, stockpiles and so on, because, there is one point here which kind of Matt Hancock has kind of gone against, I suppose, Tory doctrine in a way. So in his appearance, he said that George Osborne, when he was at the inquiry, said austerity made the NHS more resilient and better able to cope with pandemic pressures because it wasn't wasting money on silly things like stockpiles of PPE. And if you believe that, and then, crumbling school buildings just make children want to learn quicker so they can get out. But Hancock said that the NHS just doesn't have enough resources. He said, and I'm going to read this quote out, there is actually a really big question the nation needs to ask itself, which is that you wouldn't send the whole of your army out at once. You have spare capacity in case there's a crisis. Yet every single day we send our whole NHS army out into the field and there is no redundancy. We run the NHS incredibly tight. That means there isn't the resilience when a crisis comes. That would require a materially huge increase in that already very, very large NHS budget. But other countries choose to spend a higher proportion of GDP on healthcare. It means they are better able to respond. Now, that sounds to me like a Tory saying that the way the Tories have run the NHS has been a terrible idea and but also at the same time blaming voters for voting in the governments that brought in all the cuts. Does he have a point? Is this somehow all our fault, or is he gaslighting us?
Well, I don't think it's the fault of voters, but I definitely think that this is one of the issues that has repeatedly come up in the last few weeks at the start of the COVID inquiry. You've heard from people like the BMA, the Doctors' Union, from the TUC, the trade union umbrella body. They're all raising questions about how our hospitals did not have enough investment put in them in the years ahead of COVID, how nursing staff, we had shortages of nurses. If you look at the moment, they've got massive vacancies across the NHS, and the government still hasn't come up with a proper workforce plan about how you're going to get the doctors and nurses that we need to staff the NHS in the years to come. And I think that is going to end up being one of the big themes of this first bit of the pandemic, was how on earth did our hospitals not have enough resources, so that the pandemic hit, they just really struggled and kind of fell apart.
Yeah, it's not been Britain's finest moment, although of course it was amazing heroism by so many people on the NHS frontline at the time, and without whom we'd all be doing so much worse than we currently are. So at least they're picking over the bones of it, but I'm not sure we're going to get very far with Matt Hancock's evidence, or indeed any of those who were in government before or during what was going on. We're going to have to see Boris Johnson at that inquiry, aren't we? We're going to have to see him go through all the sorry and the waffle and the blaming. Do we have to?
Well, I think it's good if politicians come up and answer the questions. We know that the question has been quite robust in places, that I think it is right that all politicians who are involved in those important decisions come before the pandemic and explain what they're doing. You know, later this week that Nicola Sturgeon on Thursday is going to be before the pandemic, talking about the preparations that were made in Scotland, that I think you are going to see a steady stream of more and more politicians coming before the inquiry before it's over, and we've got a long, long way still to go.
Yeah, I mean, there is a bit of me that really wants to see Boris Johnson questioned by a couple of barristers, and I'm looking forward to that. But at the same time, I don't. I'm kind of in despair even before we start, because I know how it's going to go. But we'll have to wait and see, won't we? Thank you for that, John. Do let us know in the comments what your experiences were of the COVID inquiry, of the COVID pandemic rather, how you feel the inquiry is going. Is it answering your questions as to what went wrong and how it went wrong? Or do you already know? Do we all already know in advance what went wrong, which was people who are in charge, pretty much? Anyway, we have found some good news in the world, and it's about someone who has managed to plan ahead. And here it is. This is a lovely story. This is a tennis player called Joni Milady, who is 9 years old. Now, she started playing tennis at the age of 5. She has, as you can see there, a poorly developed left arm. She's been like that since birth. But she loves tennis, and her big heroine is Emma Raducanu. But unfortunately, because her left arm isn't developed properly, she can't throw up the ball very easily to serve. And she's found it very frustrating and difficult. So now there's a company that has helped make her a prosthetic, which she has strapped to the end of that arm, as you can see there. And it enables her to toss the ball up so she can hit it. It's not an unfair advantage. It just means that she's equivalent to someone who's got a hand on that arm. And it's just amazing. She's now managed to win her first tennis tournament at the age of 9. And maybe she's going to go on to Paralympian glory. Who knows? But she's absolutely determined to be a tennis star. John, is this proof that expending time and money and a bit of forethought on planning for things is an absolutely smashing idea?
Yeah, and just really good on that firm that decided to help her come up with this special way to get around that problem, that she couldn't toss up the ball to be able to serve, and just finding this little attachment that they can stick on the end of her prosthetic arm that allows her to do that. And just amazing that she seems to be doing really well with it. She's, as you say, she's won her first local tennis tournament, and she is hoping that she's going to go further in the game. That, yeah, I think absolutely wonderful, especially as we approach Wimbledon next week.
Exactly. And we should give a little shout out as well to the prosthetic company called Koala, which is a little sort of startup which has done this for her. Obviously a bit of publicity, but they've done a good thing, and they're helping Joni marvellously. So hopefully we'll see more of her in the years to come. And it just goes to show that if you plan and do so at the beginning of something, then perhaps you can have a better outcome at the end many years later. If only the Education Department and the NHS and the Tories had all figured that out a bit sooner. Dee says, yay, good news. Well done, Joni. You are totally awesome. Agreed, Dee, totally. Thank you for your help, John, today. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. If you are listening on podcast, please leave us a review so you can plan ahead and help other people find us. And in the meantime, we will see you all again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. Until then, tatty bye.